Dr. Subrahmanian, welcome. So glad to have you, sir.
Thank you so much. Chair Pinto, esteemed representatives, staff, and guests. One of the great thinkers in the space of early childhood recently talked about the topic of gratitude. He said, I want to let you know the great things that you do. Daniel Tiger goes on to sing, thank you for everything you do. Mr. Tiger cannot be here today, nor can Doc McStuffins, nor Professor Blippy or Bluey. But I get to be here, and I get to say thank you. Thank you for thinking about, centering, learning about children. They're a constituency who can't vote for you, who can't donate to you, who make lousy campaign volunteers, and yet you're here thinking about them, and that says a lot about you all. And so my deepest gratitude. My name is Krish Subrahmanian. I'm a pediatrician at Hennepin Healthcare. I get the privilege of teaching aspiring physicians and pediatricians at the University of Minnesota. I am one of the co-chairs of the Early Childhood Caucus for the Minnesota chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. But in my most important role, I am the father of 3 children, 6, 5, and 1, like many of you all here. As pediatricians and providers, we get the privilege of being present for some amazing moments. Some miraculous, some tragic. So this past week over Christmas, I was working in the hospital, and I got to meet a newborn baby. And the truth is that over the next 1,000 days, this baby's brain will develop more rapidly, more profoundly, and more consequentially than at any other time in their lives. The greatest teachers will be the parents, the families, those people who invest their love into this child. The greatest lessons will be the words spoken by a mother, the songs sung by a father, the smiles, the laughs. And then there are the challenging. Whenever I need to be reminded of what love is, I just have to meander into the NICU or the PICU where you see young ones fighting for their lives. And what you'll see is you'll see parents who have slept on chairs and couches for months on end. I have spoken with a mother this past week who has been at the bedside of a teenager for 2 months. And I said, I'm sorry that the couches aren't so comfortable. And she said, well, at least I get to be here. Because she knows that sometimes it's that love, those words, that presence that is the healing that medicine can't provide. And we sometimes see the tragic too. And that's when there's no one to do any of the above at the bedside. The common element in all these cases, the joyful, the tragic, is relationships, is love. And I hope to highlight the value of these relationships today, why it's imperative to the development of the early brain and to children more generally that we capacitate these relationships. In today's presentation, I hope to talk about a few things. I hope to talk about the search for early and why. Why does it matter that we think about early? I want to talk a little bit about how the brain is built and why experience matters, why relationships matters. I'll talk briefly about how pediatricians monitor these relationships and this brain development. I want to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences, stress, challenges, and how this impacts brain development. And finally, I want to speak about resilience and the capacity we all have to help build resilient children. So I started my career as a teacher. I started as a high school special education math and science teacher. And I loved my job. I taught magical, incredible young people who were passionate and excited. But I also saw ways that early childhood experiences mitigated their learning. Children who had meningitis early on, infections, people who were exposed to fetal alcohol syndrome effects, different things that affected and mitigated learning for the long term. And so while I loved every minute of my job, I also was jealous of my counterparts who taught elementary school. Their ability to teach a child to read by 3rd grade really made a profound impact in their learning as time went on. And so I did a little bit more reading, and I learned about the Matthew effect and the idea that if you can teach a child to read by third grade, they will read for fun, they will read for exercise, they will read more, and become more facile at reading, and also learn other things more rapidly and well. So I said, okay, maybe I should get into working with third graders. But then research taught me that no, you actually can start even earlier. So the Cooper et al. In 2018 did a study that showed kindergarten reading scores and kindergarten literacy skills, so letter awareness, phonemic awareness at kindergarten was actually the most predictive element of deciding how kids would do at 5th grade, both in reading and in math. And this was regardless of their level of social skills. So if you got literacy skills in by kindergarten, you made a difference in everything that they learned by 5th grade. Okay, so kindergarten is important. Then, as I began to learn, kindergarten reading was predictive of 5th grade reading skills. As I learned more, I learned, wait a minute, no, things happen even before that. So this was a time in the early 2000s when Hart and Risley had published their work on the word gap, the 30 million word gap, and the idea that kids in wealthier families got to hear a lot of words, and this correlated with 5th grade reading scores. Now, there's some methodological concerns with the Hart and Risley model, but it's been repeated over the years, and actually Romeo and company in 2018 showed this data, and they showed that in families who had higher parental education or household income, more words and more conversational turns were heard, so more interactions of language. And then this subsequently led to higher verbal scores later on. So, at this stage of my career, I wasn't sure exactly what was going on, but I knew this. Something was happening between 0 and 5 that capacitated more skills between kindergarten and 3rd grade that then led to greater learning thereafter. It was then that I sort of adventured into medical school and began learning more about why and how this was happening. So we are born with all the brain cells we will ever have, 100 billion brain cells. But the truth is, in isolation, those brain cells don't do anything. They need to be connected. They need to be connected, both sensory, motor. In order to communicate with you today, I need to be able to hear, and that pathway needs to be strong, go up to the brain, and then transmit it back to my mouth and speak with you all. What this means is that connections need to form between brains, and back to high school biology, this forms through synapses. Synapses don't just happen. They need to be practiced, they need to be built, and over the first few years of life, this happens more rapidly than at any other time in life. So you can see here some slides of what brain neuronal connections look like. So for newborns, there's a lot of brain cells, but they just don't have those synaptic connections. As you can see, over the first 2 years of life and on
Dr.
slide.
Subrahmanian, yeah, I'm just going to pause. Just want to point out for members who are maybe brand new to hearing rooms, which is true for most of you, that there are also presentations right up in these corners as well that you may be able to easier to see, because I know the details really matter. So please continue.
Oh, no, thank you, Chair Pinto. If you look at the slide on the right, you can see that up through 6 years, boy, lots of synaptic connections have happened. That's an amazing thing. You can see that compared to a 14-year-old or an adult. It's actually more dense in the school-age children. So it means that these synaptic connections need to be built. But then what happens between 6 years old and 14-year-old and beyond? What happens is we begin to practice. We begin to use certain neuronal pathways and connections, and we use those that are most important to us. So the things that make us do our daily living activities, the things that help us learn. If you are a musician or an athlete, you begin to practice those neuronal connections and those neuronal pathways. And as you can see, it thins out a little bit. But those pathways that stay are the ones that have been practiced over and over again. So the way I like to, it's akin to these beautiful temples and churches in Jordan. They're carved out of the stone. The first step we must do is we must build that wall. We must build it up. And that happens in the first 5 to 6 years. Thereafter, we must use experience to build a thing of beauty. And that is through specific experiences. Now, the other thing to think about is that there's a critical time and order to these connections. In utero, lots is happening developmentally. The brain is developing, and my NICU colleagues will talk very, very much about the importance of the in utero environment. You need to support mothers. You need to support babies. And so it begins there. But then in those first few months of life, it is really important that we have an order of connection. We need to first begin with sort of the development of our visual and auditory cortex. We need to stimulate with sound, with visual stimuli. That happens first. Subsequently, we begin to develop the areas of our brain that do with receptive language and speech production. Then subsequently, we go on to higher cognitive thinking levels. You can imagine that for a child who doesn't get the visual stimuli, who doesn't get the auditory stimuli, so let's say they have chronic ear infections and can't hear, it becomes much harder to hear. And then it becomes much harder to learn language. And then it becomes much harder to pick up the skills you're supposed to pick up at Head Start or school or wherever you may be learning the skills. So there is an ordered pattern to all of this. Now, so how to establish a great start? You know, this slide just shows very broadly that there is a genetic biological component. You need the genetic substrate, you need the physical health, you need kids to be healthy. You can imagine the ways that a severe brain infection or a traumatic brain injury could affect brain development. So you need kids to be physically healthy. But after that, it becomes very crucial that we get them the right kinds of experiences. So you see on this slide, they talk about adversity. You want to make sure that there's the right in utero environment, the right supports after a baby is born. So all those environmental factors can affect the expression of genes and brain development. And I want to show you a positive example of how that happens. So this broad equation that we need physical health, including nutrition and the basics, plus developmental experiences, including safety, the loving people, and the interactions, help to lead to a great start. But I want to show this positive example, and this is pretty incredible. So the same team, Romeo et al. In 2018, not only did they track conversational turns that they heard in a household, they also did MRI imaging of the brain to see how the brain responded. And what they found is that those babies who had more conversational turns per hour, who were exposed to more language, actually had more firing, more developed neuronal pathways in a part of the brain called the left inferior frontal gyrus. That's highlighted on this slide. So the more conversational turns that the family had, they actually had more brain activation. They were actually building neuronal connections and brain. So both the environmental consequence of hearing a lot of words, but also the physical aspect of getting more neuronal development led to higher composite language scores. So experience actually built a part of the brain, an incredible thing. Any of us who have tried to learn a language later on in life or learn a musical instrument later on in life knows that it gets harder with time. The ability to change declines with time, and the amount of effort to change goes way, way up. So one of the ways that we can capacitate this and make this happen in the lives of young people is through what we call serve and return interactions. So young children will naturally reach out for interaction through babbling, facial expressions, gestures. We then have a choice. We have a choice to respond and to interact with them, or to not. Adults who respond with the same kind of vocalizing gestures, going back and forth, really is fundamental to the wiring of children's brains. You can imagine it capacitates hearing, it capacitates the action of speaking, but also, as we've seen, it can actually build brain. These foundational pathways are constructed, and it allows everything that we want to come after that to come. So language development, the other skills that we want.